Sanishkal violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. C'est un grand honneur.
It is a great honor, or rather than a pleasure, to rise to speak today to talk about Bill C-30, an act to implement certain provisions of the Spring Economic Update.
Mise à jour économique.
It's the Spring Economic Update that was presented in April 28th, 2026. And now we're looking at Bill C-30. They're saying it's absolutely necessary to implement the Spring Economic Update.
Too far into discussing C-30, Mr. Speaker, because it's my last chance to speak in this session of Parliament until September. I do want to acknowledge once again and recognize, as I think we all do, that we're on and honored to be on the lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and to them we give enormous thanks. A huge miigwech for patience and tolerance with us. And I don't get many opportunities, Mr. Speaker, to thank the people I need to thank the most, because being the only party in this House that doesn't receive a penny of support from the parliamentary budget, being both unrecognized and unfavored. So I'm glad my colleagues from the NDP got funding to make up for what they lost when they ceased to be a recognized party. But I have less money, and I'm here. I'm not alone. And we present more amendments on more bills than much larger parties, not because we want to be meddlesome, but because we want to do the work. So I particularly want to stop for a moment and thank my Chief of Staff, Deborah Endiger, my Legislative Director, Steve Parkinson. They work harder than any team, and they are nonpartisan. I've never even stopped to ask the people on my staff team if they joined the Green Party or not, because our job here is to work for the people who elected us and for the people of Canada. And on the same tone, I'm very grateful to everyone on my MP team here in Ottawa, Michelle, Anna, and also, of course, in my Spanish Gulf Islands constituency office. They all work very hard, and it's their work that allows me to stand here before you today and speak to Omnibus Budget Bill C-30. Now, what is an omnibus bill? And I have two objections to this bill, reasons that I find this process an offense to democracy, reasons I find this bill offensive, but let me just say in two big categories. The first is that it's an omnibus budget bill, and I suggest it's even improperly considered an omnibus budget bill, as well as the fact that it's been subject to bulldozer practices to accelerate it to the point that it's not been properly studied. Now, what is an omnibus bill? Well, obviously, I'm not asking you, Speaker. You know very well. An omnibus bill is from the Latin. It means a lot of things. It's omni. A lot of things all at once in one package. So it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's all in one bill. And this makes it difficult for members of Parliament because there's inevitably and invariably, as the case for me right now, there are things in C-30 I like. I'll call those the good, and I'll discuss what those are. Then there's bad, and then there's ugly. But really offensive in this kind of process is when the bill isn't split up so that committees that have expertise in, say, you had a committee, we don't actually have committees called We'll Study All the Bad Things, we're that committee, and We'll Study All the Ugly Things. So let's send the ugly to the ugly committee. Basically, it means that if there are changes to the environmental standards in this country or health standards, from my point of view as a parliamentarian, those should go to the committees that have expertise in environment or health. But that's not the case here. Everything in this bill, whether it was about privatizing airports or getting skilled workers or getting rid of the excise tax or really drastically reducing protection from dangerous pesticides, all only went to the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee was given very little time. Now that's after, how did it get to committee? Well, first, after first reading of this bill, which was, first reading was on April 29th, the very day after the Spring Economic Statement was tabled, there were only 3 hours of debate in this place before the government brought forward a motion for time allocation on May 25th. I hadn't been able to get a speech in at second reading, and then the bill passed on division, so there was no recorded vote. Off it goes to committee. What committee? The Finance Committee. I have nothing against the Finance Committee. I've spent a lot of time with them these last few weeks, hoping to be able to speak to my amendments. But it's quite wrong in principle to have a committee that doesn't have any expertise and didn't have the time because of the rush they were in to hear from a single witness on key areas where scientific knowledge and background and independent expertise could be brought to bear. Well, let me just go back to the theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly and take that apart. The good, I was very pleased in the spring economic statement and in the funding to see funding for endangered species, particularly the southern resident killer whale. My pleasure in seeing that in the spring economic statement was somewhat undone, or profoundly undone, by May 8th discussion paper, which suggested that they would lift the provisions of the Species at Risk Act to allow the extinction of species, and particularly at threat the southern resident killer whales, because they're in the way of more tankers and pipelines and such. But let me just say that it was good to see reference to whales in particular in the spring economic statement, and I'm also relieved, having mentioned the May 8th discussion documents, I won't mention them again, but the discussion period has been extended from June 7th to July 22nd. I urge Canadians who are concerned to get their thoughts into the government, and let's hope we never see legislation in this place implementing anything that was in those discussion documents, and when we resume the House in September. Also good in the spring economic statement, and also found in the legislation, is reestablishing incentives for electric vehicles. There are a few other things that I would say, yes, I would certainly vote for that. Pleased to see it. I mean, we don't see any details here on the one line in the spring economic statement, flexible pathways for automakers to meet Canada's climate objectives. We haven't seen any details on that yet, but we hope to. There are other things, and certainly protecting auto workers with a worker retention grant, anything to do to help housing. We're in favor of those things, which makes it difficult because we have to vote against Bill C-22 because of the bad and the ugly that are thrown into the same pot. We have to vote on that one pot. Now, I mentioned, just as casually there for a moment, that I don't think this is a legitimate omnibus bill. Now, why do I put that forward? To be a legitimate omnibus bill, all the measures in the bill must relate to the budget in a fundamental way. And I suggest that it's pretty sketchy that there's only one quite anodyne line found in the whole spring economic statement as a justification for one of the worst thing that I think I've ever seen in an omnibus bill, which is the deregulation of pesticides. And that's found on page 96 of the spring economic statement. And all it says is this: announces the government's intention to amend Canadian Food Inspection Agency Act and the Pest Control Products Act to include consideration of food security and cost of food. Now, in reading that on the day, April 28th, I certainly didn't say, oh my goodness, consideration of food security and cost of food must mean that they're about to put something in that will allow Cabinet as a whole with political considerations to overturn a decision of the minister responsible and the department responsible after they've done a study of the danger of a pesticide. It doesn't leap out at one. In fact, it's hidden. Not only does it not leap out, it is hiding, as it is in Bill C-30 in Division 8. But that's not the only thing I want to concentrate on, although I will take most of the time, and I am grateful for the chance to speak to this bill now, finally, in this place. The removal of the excise tax, I had asked in question period before. The excise tax, I realize it's announced as a way of alleviating pressure and helping Canadians with affordability. And Greens really recognize the affordability crisis. We see it as absolutely connected to the climate crisis. The cost of food goes up when crops fail because of climate disasters and extreme drought here in Canada and around the world. There is an affordability crisis. The cost of housing is increasingly out of reach. The cost of energy and electricity in our homes. We could have virtually free electricity once we install the infrastructure, which is easy to roll out solar panels, except that our provincial utilities get in the way. In any case, cheaper electricity, the cheapest source of electricity, reducing the cost for everyone, would come from focusing on renewable electricity. And I do think there's some promise, although it needs a lot of work. There's a discussion paper out on an east-west, north-south electricity grid. But to build that out, we really need to shift off fossil fuels and to renewables. But another point I want to make about the excise tax, and this goes back to 2009, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper took the gas tax, it was then called, that fund, Stephen Harper decided to make permanent and at the disposal of municipalities for transit and infrastructure. This is what the Federation of Canadian Municipalities never ceases to point out. They need predictable, stable funding. And that was one of the best things Stephen Harper did, and was to say that excise gas tax is a permanent source of funding for municipalities for transit and infrastructure. But now this C-30 and the Spring Economic Statement do away with that. They do say, well, we're going to have this municipal fund. We're going to help with infrastructure for municipalities. I was just in Edmonton at the annual meeting of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. They do not find the pathway clear. There is no map. It is not an easy route to navigate for local governments to figure out, does this really replace what we had in the transit funding? How do we get from here to there? And while we're building housing, by the way, you can't build a house unless you can flush the toilets in that house. So municipalities are crying out for predictable funding for water and wastewater. I would love to have seen that clearly in the Spring Economic Statement. So we've gotten rid of a predictable fund created under Stephen Harper for municipalities for transit and infrastructure, and we've replaced it with press releases. I really hope the government means it, and the money will be there for municipalities, and that they will very quickly, in this government, start recognizing that the local order of government are the strongest and best partners you're going to find. They're more reliable than your friend Daniel Smith, Mr. Prime Minister. They are more reliable. They show up, and they have shovel-ready projects, and they're ready to go, and they keep their promises. They don't feel, at this point, I was in Edmonton, I can't quote any mayor in particular, nor would I want to. It wouldn't be fair. But they certainly don't feel the love right now that they're engaged as partners, and they don't know where they find municipal infrastructure funding. Now, moving along here to Division 8 of C-30, which is the most hidden and the ugliest part of this omnibus budget bill. These are the reductions of protection for Canadians' health and the environment in the regulations made under the Pest Control Products Act. Now, this is, again, in Division 8. It rests, all of this appears to rest on one unproven, untested, there's not even a link in the language that's used within the Spring Economic Statement or the budget itself, or C-30 itself. But it clearly, by inference, rests on this assumption. More pesticides are going to reduce food costs. Now that's a leap. More pesticides are going to reduce food prices. Now, help the economy. Now let's just say that that's wrong on the evidence in two ways. It's wrong on the evidence because our partners and allies, point one, it's wrong on trade and it's wrong on ecosystems. On trade, our partners and allies have stricter pesticide laws than we do. As a matter of fact, historically, Canada has the weakest pesticide laws of our allies. By the way, we were the only country in the world, well, I think certainly the only country in the G20 that never banned Agent Orange, just as an example. We never banned 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, the 2,4,5-T that was half of Agent Orange. It remained legal in Canada until, through an agreement between the US EPA and Dow Chemical, they weren't allowed to export it anymore because it was too dangerous. Canada kept saying it was okay, but Canadian buyers couldn't get any because Dow Chemical wasn't, by law, allowed to export their remaining stocks to anywhere. Thankfully, because we would have kept it registered forever as far as I can see. We continue to use glyphosate when the EU is restricting it. We continue to use neonicotinoid insecticides. Now, what does that mean in terms of trade? It means that Canadian food exports, grain exports, have been rejected at the border in France and in other EU countries because the residues of pesticides that are legal in Canada on our food crops are not legal in the EU. So we should strive to meet the best, have the same high standards as the highest standards found around the world, so there'd be no country where Canadian exports would be rejected at the border because they had too many toxic chemicals in the residues. That would be, I think, a good place to go to ensure that we provide good trade links and reliable export markets for Canadian farmers. but we don't. As well as, of course, the fact we do also, this is the reason that Canadian beef isn't allowed in many EU countries, because the International Centre for Research on Cancer in Lyon, France, found years ago that the hormones injected into Canadian beef, the International Agency for Research on Cancer believe increase the risks of human cancer. So that's why we lose markets there. We should strive to ensure that we have reliably and certified organic markets and growing and production of food products, so that we have markets in countries that have stricter standards for health protection than we do. But we're not doing that. We're going in the other direction. It's astonishing to me when we think about food security. Let's talk about Indigenous communities. Food security often means being able to access food off the land. I'll use as an example the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in Vancouver, in Burrard Inlet, where they've been doing extensive work on restoring the ecosystem health of Burrard Inlet. They've been planting eelgrass, doing much work in what had been an industrial setting to get it clean enough and healthy enough to produce shellfish that can be harvested for human consumption. That's a right the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has. Now, quite casually, we keep hearing from government ministers in both British Columbia and Victoria, and here in Ottawa and the Liberals saying, well, we can dredge Vancouver Harbour. This is thrown out as if it's a great idea, without any consideration that they haven't talked to the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. If you dredge Vancouver Harbour, you're going to stir up 100 years' worth of heavy metals and toxic chemicals, and it's not going to be possible for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation to harvest shellfish from an area that stirred up 100 years' worth of industrial waste, so that you can what? Move bigger tankers loaded with dilbit, which is a mixture that can't be cleaned up if it spills. This is all madness. It's not food security for First Nations if you keep contaminating the territories from which they harvest their foods. Back to the ecosystem issue. Why is this a nonsense that this is going to help food production? Food production, agriculture needs pollinators. The reasons the EU has reduced neonicotinoid insecticides is that the pollinators of this world, the insect pollinator population, is going down. And it's related to the use of pesticides like neonicotinoids. Well, if Bill C-30 goes in, and it has now gone through clause by clause, it's had all the amendments it's going to get. And what it says is, if the government agency decides it's too dangerous for the environment to use this particular pesticide, Cabinet, and it doesn't set out the criteria, it gives the vaguest of language, Cabinet, if it decides in its political discretion that to protect national economic security, I'm quoting, regional economic security or national food security, that they should allow a dangerous pesticide to be used, well, so be it. There's no appeal, that's it. And it can last for up to 9 years as an extension. With the 2 minutes I have left, Mr. Speaker, I am incensed that this is happening. If people think there's never been a time where in Canada anyone would ever put the economic interests of an industry ahead of human health and safety, let me quote from 1976 and then Minister of Natural Resources for the province of New Brunswick, Roland Boudreau. Because when it became clear that children were dying of Rye syndrome in New Brunswick because of forest aerial spraying for the forest industry, this is a quote, "I don't like to see people dying. This is one of the things I really wouldn't like to see. But at the same time, knowing the forest as it is, my decision will have to be with the forest, with the future of New Brunswick," close quote. We're opening the door and going backwards. Is there any other country on earth going backwards on pesticide regulation? Anyone? Anywhere? Well, yeah, you guessed it, the Trump White House. This story from the New York Times, May 7th, 2026. Trump administration lifts ban on cyanide bomb on public lands so they can kill coyotes. Well, in this country, even without C-30, the PMRA reversed itself to allow liquid strychnine to kill gophers on prairie lands. We need more protection for human health, not less. And if this government wants to tell us they want to build Canada strong, then stop and think twice. You're killing the precautionary principle. You're running the risk of killing Canadians. This is not hyperbole. It's happened in the past. You're opening the door. I'm sorry, the government, the honourable government, our right honourable Prime Minister, is opening the door to the most regressive policies Canada has ever seen to protect human health and the environment. It's not even helpful for the economy. But they don't bother doing the studies. They just make the assumptions and issue the press releases.
Questions